This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Gift magical mornings with Nespresso Virtuo Pop. Compact and stylish, Virtuo Pop is made to meet every morning coffee craving. From espresso to coffee, hot or iced, at the click of a button. And celebrate the season with Nespresso's limited edition coffee flavors. Sweet almond and hibiscus, cinnamon and candied tamarind, and festive double espresso. Magic in the making. Shop the holiday gift collection exclusively at Nespresso.com.
This episode is brought to you by Disney. This Thanksgiving, Judy Hopps and Nick Wilde are back on the big screen. So grab your family and friends as Disney invites you to return to Zootopia for the phenomenal movie event of the holiday season. See all your favorite Zootopia characters plus new favorites in the most pawsome movie of the year. Don't miss Disney Zootopia 2 when it hits theaters everywhere November 26th. Get your tickets now.
This is the Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm Rebecca Larson, and I'm very, very happy to welcome back again Dr. Stephen Veerapen. Welcome.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, as always, for having me.
Yeah, it's been a little while since I've had you on, but, you know, anytime I want to talk about Scotland, you're like my go-to guy.
There are worse things to be known for.
And I love it. And I have to say, I just love it because we talk about Scotland and I love your accent. It just makes it more real.
Thank you. This is me toning it down.
I can't even imagine. Oh, I love the accent. Anyway, today I asked you to come on because I feel like when it comes to Scottish history, I am not very good at it. I know the very basics. And I asked you if you could come on and talk with me today about James IV and James V, because, well, when we look at the Tudors, they're probably the most significant Jameses in Scottish history, right?
Yeah. People tend to overlook Scotland quite a bit because Henry takes up all the air in the room, I think. And there's so much going on in Henry VIII's private life and political life that it almost, many books would become far too big if they also look at what was going on in Scotland next door. And one of the things that I talk about in the book I'm currently working on is historians, I think, have very often treated Scotland as it was, as an independent kingdom with its own thing going on, with its own monarchy and its own dramas and everything. And that makes sense because it was an independent kingdom. We know this. We know Scotland was a sovereign country at the time, separate from England. Why this is a problem, though, or why looking at things like that is a problem, is that's not how Henry saw things. Henry was very insistent from the outset of his reign until the end that Scotland was not an independent kingdom, should not be an independent kingdom. It should be under English suzerainty. And the King of England was owed homage by the kings of Scotland. So Henry was very clear on this, and he would go to the archives on multiple occasions trying to prove it. He was determined that Scotland should be akin to Ireland. It should be a lordship, which is kind of under the control of the English crown. That wasn't reality. And part of Scotland's independence was its independent monarchy. Part of its independence was its recognition by the papacy. Now, that latter thing, Henry obviously took issue with later in his life. So the fact that the Pope had recognised Scotland as an independent kingdom was a problem for Henry because the Pope the Bishop of Rome had no such authority. So all of these things led to quite a lot of rivalry between Scotland and England, but it wasn't even just a post-Reformation thing. Henry had been doing this from the start of his reign. He'd been claiming, and I quote, "I am the very owner of Scotland."
That guy had an ego on him, didn't he?
He certainly did.
I was thinking a lot about Scottish history over the weekend, knowing that I was going to talk with you about this. And I thought, when I think of Scottish monarchs, I feel like every reign ended so tragically. Is that just an outsider's perspective, or was it really like that?
It was really like that. The Scottish monarchs, particularly the Stuarts, had, for whatever reason, a very short shelf life. And this led to quite a lot of minorities. When we think of who came to the throne in their minority, well, James IV did, very young. James V did, very young. His daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, did, very young. Her son, James VI, did at 13 months old. So, yes, all kinds of political dramas were enacted. Deaths seemed to visit early. So, freak deaths, James II blowing up his own leg, severing his femoral artery by standing too close to a cannon. James I being stabbed to death in a sewer. So we see quite a lot of early deaths. It was not good to be the King of Scots, I don't think.
No. The other thing I was thinking about was Mary Stewart, was she the first Queen Regnant of Scotland?
Yes, she was. Well, there had been the Maid of Norway, but she was never enthroned or anything, so she could have been, but she wasn't. Mary was the first ruling Queen Regnant, and there was no opposition to this. This is what fascinates me. There was never any dubiety about it. There was never any question about, oh, can we accept a woman? They did, and she was accepted. It was only later in her life, not much later, but slightly later, that you start to see John Knox, for example, railing against the monstrous regiment of women.
Right.
Prior to that, in 1542, when she became queen at 6 days old, there was no opposition. There was no, oh, we can't have a baby female. By this time, I think, oh God, here we go again, another minority who will rule in her name.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, so let's start, maybe do some comparisons between James IV and James V. When you look at their reigns independently, what do you notice is the most different about the two reigns?
Oh, that's a good question, because I tend to see the similarities more than the differences. The similarities, so if we think about when James IV in his youth came to the throne, it was as a result of his father being slain in battle in 1588, and James IV was part of this and supposedly carried a great deal of guilt throughout his life because he'd been used as a figurehead by the rebels against his father. And the story goes that he wore an iron belt throughout his life, and each year added a chain to it to weigh it down further as a symbol of his guilt. How true that is, we don't know. But similarly, James V, as I said, also came to the throne young. Both men were surrounded by politicians who were vying for power. Both men were very interested in Scottish independence. Both men were very interested in Catholicism and being a son of Rome, faithful sons of Rome. In fact, James IV got the title Defender of the Faith. We know who else was given that title after it was stripped from James IV. But both were very keen on also elevating the crown. So one of the downsides of all the minorities that had been happening in all the early deaths of Scottish kings was that the Scottish crown had become somewhat tarnished. So it was very easy for overmighty nobles to gain a lot of power because there were weak young kings. Mm-hmm. So both James IV and James V were very keen to elevate the crown back, to turn what had been King of Scots, which was not a territorial title, it was almost a kind of primus inter pares system, or first amongst equals, equals being the nobility. They were keen to make this more of a King of Scotland, more like, I'd hesitate to say absolutist, but more like the territorial big magnates. And they both had significant successes in doing that. Both became respected and slightly feared monarchs. The differences, I think, and I know this, I'm going to lean into psychology now, but the differences seem to be that James V was a deeply paranoid man. I mean, there was a lot of his uncle in him, I think. There was a lot of Henry VIII. He never lived to get to any excesses of anything, but there was a sense of paranoia, for example, that was present in him. There was a sense of worry. There was a willingness to get rid of his servants. Whereas James IV, for whatever reason, seems to have been much more magnanimous. And so in Scottish history, he is very much seen as the good Renaissance king, the kind of bold, heroic, jousting hero.
I love this. So far, I'm really enjoying this. I just have to say.
They're fascinating figures. I mean, it's like having this lost season of the Tudors or something like this. It's having this extra story.
Yes. Well, when I think of James the Fourth, right, I think of his marriage to Margaret Tudor. And for those who maybe are new to this history, can you explain what was behind the treaty for the marriage between Margaret Tudor and James the Fourth?
Yes. So there was a great deal of conflict between Henry VII and the new King of Scots, James IV. But neither of them really wanted conflict. They both wanted some sort of peace. And as we see moves towards a peace treaty, what do we see? Well, everyone I'm sure knows that we see Catherine of Aragon coming into play as the prospective bride of Prince Arthur, Prince of Wales. But what we also see is James IV very, very eager to make his own Spanish match. He wants Catherine of Aragon. So that's something that, again, a lot of people I don't think about very much. But the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, were instructing their ambassadors really to string him along. They had no intention of sending Catherine to Scotland because they'd already kind of agreed, but not really, but sort of, to marry her into England. So they were instructed to string James along. And there's a wonderful story of the Spanish ambassadors who were sent to Scotland, for some reason, sent ahead their instructions before themselves, or the instructions from Ferdinand and Isabella arrived in Scotland before the ambassadors did, and James read them. James sneakily read these instructions and realised exactly what the Spanish were up to. And so he elected to pursue an English match. And Henry VII, I think, he offered various women, or at least some lesser women, but James was, I think, adamant, no, it must be a princess of England. So Henry eventually offered Margaret, who's very young, significantly younger than her husband. And this became very optimistically named the Treaty of Perpetual Peace between Scotland and England, which was sealed by this marriage, which Linda Porter has brilliantly written about in The Thistle and the Rose. This marriage was meant to seal the future. Interestingly, supposedly, now this was recorded in Henry VIII's reign, but Henry VII was allegedly questioned at the council table on, well, what happens if your line fails and only the issue from this Thistle and the Rose marriage is left? Won't then Scotland gain England by this? And Henry VII supposedly pointed out that no, because Scotland is the smaller country, it will be England acquiring Scotland by this method. And everyone clapped. So that was what really motivated the marriage, this idea of peace, but also the creation of a kind of Stewart-Tudor line, which, as we know, bore fruit in 1603. Well, prior to 1603, but the unification of the crowns happened in 1603.
You could almost say that James IV and Margaret Tudor were like the head of the, how do I want to say this? The head of the throne of Great Britain. Like, they were responsible
for that marriage. Mary, Queen of Scots, wouldn't have had her claim to England. James, obviously James VI, and then first, would not have become James I of England. Right. So yeah, it goes back to this, and James certainly was very proud of this. Look where he is buried, in the Lady Chapel with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, his great-great-grandparents. So he was aware of this Tudor, Stuart, Anglo-Scottish lineage.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a big deal. I think it's funny, it was the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, right? And then it was
I said.
it didn't take long, right, for the Battle of Flodden to happen in 1513. And now I didn't even know about the Catherine of Aragon twist in this whole story.
Oh
So
yes,
now,
Henry was off in France in 1513 fighting, and that's when James IV invaded. And something that always annoys me about quite a lot of history books is they'll claim that when Henry was off in France, James IV took the opportunity to invade England as though this was a kind of sneaky thing.
yeah.
James had a treaty with France just as Henry had his own treaties. So Henry was acting according to treaty, so was James. I mean, this wasn't a kind of sneaky, the Scots sneak in the back door when the English king's out of town. It was, no, the Scots act on an international treaty when the King of England acts on an international treaty. So Henry was very keen to present this as kind of perfidious Scots behaving badly. And Catherine backed him up on this. Catherine was left behind in England as was Captain General, was her title. So she was in charge of mounting the defence against the Scots when the Battle of Flodden took place. And for those that don't know, the Battle of Flodden was James IV, again, acting according to a treaty with the French, in mounting an attack on England because Henry had mounted an attack on France. But at this Battle of Flodden, James IV was killed. One of his illegitimate sons, she talks about, that's another thing that bound James V and James IV, his father. They were both productive, just not always with their wives. But he was killed. One of his illegitimate sons was killed. I mean, it was sort of every noble family, multiple sort of princes of the church. This was a disaster. I liken it in the book on Henry to, like, if the gunpowder plot in 1605 had succeeded and it had wiped out most of the political nation, that's what happened in Scotland in 1513 with the Battle of Flodden, is a whole generation of politicians were just gone. Henry was delighted. So was Catherine of Aragon. We were absolutely delighted. Catherine famously offered to send she sent the bloody coat, and she said she would have been happy to send James's body, but her English subjects would not suffer it.
I love that part of the story.
Yeah.
And now
Catherine of Aragon, you don't always see, is this kind of militant daughter of Isabella.
Yes, exactly. I just find it ironic that there were, James IV wanted to marry her, and then she was the one that was, behind the scenes leading the charge against him when he was killed.
Yeah. History takes some very strange turns. And similarly, Margaret Tudor was Catherine's sister-in-law, and she had seen her husband off. She had watched him made off, and then romantic legend says she watched from the Lithgow Palace for him coming back, which he never did.
Oh.
But Margaret had one of the most difficult jobs, I think, of any married female in Renaissance Britain as this kind of pawn, because Henry VIII expected her as his sister. I don't think he cared very much about her. You see that in the fact that he was withholding Henry VII's bequest to her. Henry VII had left her property, money, jewels, and Henry wouldn't hand them over. But he expected her to be England's woman in Scotland and to sort of do his bidding, whereas James, her husband, expected her to be Scotland's adoptive maternal figure and to also give him access to England by virtue of her brother. So what a horrible position. And she was so young.
I can't even. It's almost the same with his sister Mary when he sends her to France to marry. Yeah. Like what the arrogance of Henry VIII to think that, obviously they wanted to be able to align themselves with allies, right? They wanted these allies, but once your sibling, your sister is in that country, how much control does she's a woman. She doesn't have much control over her husband, the king. So Henry, in his arrogance, I think, kind of came back and bit him a few times.
Yeah. And I've often wondered how much of it was from his early reign when Catherine of Aragon had virtually been a kind of extra Spanish ambassador. She had been performing quite politically. If he then expected that of his sisters to be almost English ambassadors to Scotland, English ambassadors to France.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. I just love this. History is so fascinating. I don't understand when people look at history and say it's boring, because there are so many fascinating stories to uncover once you start Scotland. I feel like Scotland is so overlooked, and we need to talk about it more and its importance in history, right?
Yeah, yeah. Considering the kind of antics various Scots have got up to in the past, yes. But also in terms of religious history and how the Reformations worked differently in Scotland versus England, and what impact that had on British history is, I think, massive. I mean, look at the Civil Wars. They started partly in Ireland, partly in Scotland, but we think of them as this big conflict between Charles I and Parliament. That didn't just appear out of nowhere. There had been Charles attempting to inflict the English prayer book on Scotland, which had resulted in civil wars. So
yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's flip to James V a little bit. We'll kind of go back and forth today, but let's talk about James V as a king and how they were able to choose a queen for him. I mean, it kind of seems obvious now, right? But I kind of want to know what was happening behind the scenes when it came to that.
well, he is a really good case study, I think, of the choices that Scotland had at this period in its history. And they were very much either pro-English, so you could have your pro-English party, or pro-French, you could have your pro-French party. James, obviously, by virtue of his mother, Margaret Tudor, might be expected to have been pro-English, but it didn't really work out. And the reason it wasn't Margaret's fault, I hasten to say here, it was the fault of her dreadful husband, the Earl of Angus. So in short order, actually, after James died at Flodden, she remarried. And her choice was unfortunate, I think, and historians have long debated, was this a love match? And she's portrayed in a lot of the older histories as like a romantic-minded fool that couldn't keep her libido in check and had to marry this handsome young man. He was a significant political player, and it seems that she married him hoping to build up a party, which partly worked, but he was the flaw here because, I mean, almost from the start, he was keeping a mistress and moving this mistress into Margaret's dower properties and things like this crazy stuff. But what we also find is he was extremely pro-English. So Margaret, you would expect, is unambiguously pro-English in the wake of her husband's death. She's not. She still has her kind of beef with Henry VIII, whereas Angus is pro-power. I mean, he's not all that dissimilar to the later Lord Darnley, I don't think. Maybe not quite as murderous, but he is very pro-English. He accepts a pension from Henry VIII. He swears to pretty much sell out Scotland if he can have a share in ruling it under Henry VIII's kind of overlordship, which is what Henry was eager for. And he takes custody of James at various points, particularly when James is a young teenager, and tries to keep him away from power and tries to keep him satisfied. I mean, there's stories that he was introducing like mistresses to this young man, all of this sort of stuff, trying to keep him distracted with sports and things. But James ended up absolutely hating his stepfather, despising him, and despising Angus's brother, George Douglas, and pretty much hating the entire Douglas family, which had very dark sequels. So James became extremely anti-English, not just pro-French, but extremely anti-English. He hated and distrusted his stepfather. He very much distrusted his uncle, Henry VIII. He had an ambivalent relationship with his mother, Margaret, actually. But overall, he was very, very pro-French, very swayed towards the French Catholic Party, at the same time as Henry VIII was breaking with Rome and trying to force Scotland and Scotland's king to follow his lead. I mean, Henry had some really revealing stuff going on. He was writing, for example, to Scotland and to James, telling him, dissolve the monasteries, you can make a lot of money from it. Later on in Henry's reign, so this is after James V actually, he's writing to the governor of Scotland, Governor Arran, telling him exactly how to do it. I mean, there's this really amazing document in which Henry says, you must send out visitations to the monasteries under colour of assessing them, but really you're finding out how much they're worth and you're going to strip them. So Henry was not entirely religiously motivated, he was also money motivated. But James says no to all of this. James elects to play ball with Rome. And what was interesting about his reign is he actually got quite a lot of concessions. I think the Pope was worried that another British country might break away. So he offered quite a lot of concessions to James V as a faithful son of Rome. So James was able to do quite a lot of sort of work within the church and make appointments within the churches and stuff that would have had to go through Rome without having to break with Rome, whereas Henry VIII had to break with Rome to get to do what he wanted.
Yeah, exactly. So as husbands, how would you rate James IV and James V?
James IV, apart from the age thing, which is very unpleasant, seems to have been a fairly loving husband, to the extent that Margaret wrote a very kind of annoyed and aggrieved letter to Henry VIII saying that she puts her faith in her husband and not her brother, because James was giving her money and giving her her property and Henry was withholding her property and her money. So he also seems to have shaved because she didn't like his beard. That's a fairly pleasant story. Almost at the start of their marriage, apparently the new young queen disliked her husband's very luxuriant beard, and so he shaved it off for her, which is sweet. Also presumably made him look a bit younger. But as a husband, he seems to have been a decent one. Now, there is obviously the question of all the illegitimate children, but I'm going to maybe surprise people by saying none of those children seem to have been born after the marriage.
Oh.
All of the illegitimate children that we know of were before.
Interesting.
So it seems that he might well have been a faithful husband, which you wouldn't expect. We find a similar thing with James V. There are lots of problematic illegitimate children who cause trouble sometimes for Mary Queen of Scots, the legitimate child, but not after he's married Marie of Guise. There is one dubious report that he had a mistress after that, but it was from a hostile source. Similarly, there was a kind of silly story about James IV being late to the Battle of Flodden, and that caused disaster because he was making love to Lady Heron. It's nonsense. There are, as far as we know, the actual physical evidence is that all the illegitimate children and all the affairs and everything were before the marriages. So they seem, and it is just seem, to have been fairly faithful husbands. Certainly more faithful than was Henry VIII.
Yeah. Okay, I have to go back because when you were talking about Margaret Tudor, a bell went off in my head, and the reputation that she may have had of being like this romantic woman who couldn't help but fall in love with men. And it sounds so similar to the story of Mary Queen of Scots, doesn't it? Like, how ironic that their story ends up sounding so similar.
Yeah. Women who marry must do it for love. Men who marry are doing it for political or religious reasons. That seems to be a general attitude. I don't know why. But I think part of it as well is people have looked at the choices that Mary Queen of Scots made and that Margaret Tudor made, and they've been confused as to why would you marry this person? And because you're a woman, it must be because you love them.
Right.
They're maybe not so much looking at, I mean, the classic example of this isn't Margaret Tudor, although it's the same thing going on, I think. It's Lord Darnley. People, even in the good biographies of Mary Queen of Scots, always state, oh, she just fell head over heels in love with this handsome, tall youth. And I think, wait a minute, wasn't that handsome tall youth also her first cousin, also Prince of the Blood in England, who held the sword when the Earl of Leicester was elevated? Didn't he have a claim to the throne? To two thrones, actually. He had a claim to the Scottish throne and the English. How convenient that of all the handsome young men she could fall in love with, it was this extremely politically useful one.
Yeah.
I think that was a political match. Mary Queen of Scots never loved Darnley. She thought he was a tool. He was a tool in various ways. But I think she thought he was a tool that she could use to produce an heir who would be an indisputable heir to the English and Scottish thrones. And that's exactly what she did. Similarly, Bothwell, I mean, Mary, there are all kinds of questions there about what he might or might not have done to her. But she said herself at one point that it was a religious choice because the Protestants were rebelling against her and petitioned her to marry not just a Protestant, but him. And so she did. That's not romantic. It was only when it was a case of slandering her as having murdered Darnley and being engaged in this crazy romantic affair that any talk of love came into it, and it was an attack on her. It wasn't a love story. The love story was created to make her look like a wanton, kind of insatiable temptress.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I know our focus today is James the Fourth and Fifth, but after talking about Margaret and Mary, I just have to know, was this a consistent pattern with Scottish queens that they were seen as these overly romantic women who, I don't know, couldn't make decisions for themselves?
Not quite surprisingly. What we find in Scottish history, more so than in English history, is that prior to the Reformation, so prior to 1560 in Scotland, widows, so this is after the husbands had died, royal widows actually expected to wield power. So they were expected to become regents. So we see this recur. In the wake of James IV's death, Margaret was installed as tutrix, was the term used, female tutor, governor of her son, and she was expected to govern. But this has also fueled the idea that, what a silly woman, she had that power and then she just gave it away because the terms of that stated that if she remarried, she lost that kind of regency power. And she did remarry, as I said, very quickly. Is this because she was an idiot who couldn't control her lusts and so she chose a man over power? No. How do we know this? Because even when she had power right after James IV's death and she was installed as kind of regent, people were trying to oust her in favour of the Duke of Albany, who was a descendant of James III. So that reason behind her marriage to Angus, I think, was to build up her own party, to outflank the Albanists, the people that were behind Albany and trying to get rid of her. She wasn't a popular figure after the death of James IV. She was an English woman after the English had just killed the King of Scots, her husband. So she was very, very deeply distrusted. And they had this other figure that they wanted as regent. So they were trying to boot her out as soon as she took up the reins of power. That's why she married Angus, I think.
Wow. It's too bad, because it seems like she liked it in Scotland. She enjoyed her time there, right?
Yeah, I think she very quickly spoke the language, because we can tell from her letters, she writes to Henry VIII very frequently in Scots. So she's writing to him in Scots language. She went native very quickly. But that, I think, shows that that's where she was at home. Not that she didn't go back to England. She went back to England very famously in 1517, around the time of the May Day riots. She was in England and she was there for about a year. And she was shown a lot of favour by her brother at that stage because he was trying to turn her back. He was trying to he didn't want her at the English court particularly, but he and Catherine of Aragon lavished favour on her and retained her daughter by Angus, Margaret Douglas, in England, and she went into Wolsey's household. And this wasn't for no reason. This was because Henry was trying to load her up with compliments and pro-English sentiment before sending her back to Scotland to act in his interests there.
Yeah. I feel like Lady Margaret Douglas had a real chance at becoming the first Queen Regnant of England. And I find it fascinating when we look at Henry and his sister Margaret and how he excluded Margaret and any of her children from the line of succession. Why? Was he afraid of a Scottish person ruling in England?
So no one knows why. My suspicion is that because he repeatedly claimed that the Scottish kings were client kings, that he didn't believe that they should rule England. So he cut out the line that resulted in them. He did at various points supposedly claim, he'll make James V, for example, his heir. He had no intention of doing that, as witnessed the fact that he never did it. He just kind of floated it occasionally to keep the Scots in check. I don't think he ever had any intention of leaving his throne to a Scottish king, because again, these kings to Henry owed him homage. They were inferior kings. In fact, they're called under kings in one of the chronicles. They were the under kings of England.
Wow. Okay, so let's get back to James IV and James V, because obviously that's the topic of today, but I always lean toward the women, so I'm sorry. When it comes to these two, which one of the two of them had the greatest impact on history?
Oh, that's a very good question, because one could say James V because he produced Mary Queen of Scots, who in turn produced James, who united. So again, but then you could say James V wouldn't exist without James IV. James IV probably has had the bigger cultural impact, I think. Although it does, most people, even in Scotland, don't know who he is.
Wow.
Don't know who James IV is, because we're not taught really about that period. When I was in school, we were taught the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the Nazis. We weren't really taught about the Jameses.
Wow.
But James IV has kind of gone down in history as the Renaissance king, the first Renaissance king. So he was rivaled by Henry VII, who had a very sort of Renaissance-y Burgundy-style court. But he was then rivaled more strongly by Henry VIII. And we can see almost direct rivalries, because James IV is going around holding jousting tournaments, for example. He is building ships, the Great Michael, or the Michael, which was bigger than Henry's Mary Rose. I think that was part of the point, was to make it bigger and more splendid. He was using a lot of Arthurian imagery and rhetoric to try and suggest that the Scottish kings were these British figures, whereas Henry VII and Henry VIII were doing it to show that the English kings were these inheritors to King Arthur. So we see rivalry there. James IV, I suppose, is the more fun king to read about and write about. James V politically might be the more interesting one, though, because that's when you start to get the rise of Protestantism going on. And you have his marriage to, and we've not spoken about her, Marie of Guise. James V didn't take an English bride at all, although Mary, later Mary I of England, was at various points mooted as a potential bride. But James V ended up marrying into France because, as I said, he was very Francophile. He married first Madeline of France, who died shortly after arriving in Scotland. The weather was blamed, but I think she was consumptive even before she came over from Paris. And then he married Mary of Guise, and this was a massively influential marriage. This was a woman who not just produced Mary Queen of Scots, but who wielded power as regent again after her husband died.
Yeah. So when you compare the two women then as regents, Margaret Tudor and Marie of Guise, I feel like the answer is obvious now, but who do you think was more successful as a regent?
Marie of Guise, I think, although it descended into a huge number of problems, religious problems, and national problems, actually. She was extremely pro-Catholic, and she was understandably extremely pro-French. And at this time, towards the end of her life, she flooded Scotland with French troops, which caused a lot of resentment in Scotland and turned a number of people to the Protestants because they were making us, say, French Catholics. We can't have that. So that turned a lot of converts to Protestantism, and those converts and a lot of those Protestant leaders, including that illegitimate half-brother of Mary Queen of Scots, looked to England for support, and Cecil and the new queen there, Elizabeth I from 1558, gave them financial support and a bit of military support, which allowed the Reformation to happen. So had Mary of Guise not died, probably of dropsy, in 1560, who knows, she might have been more successful. She seemed to manage fairly well from 1554, when she got the regency, to her death in 1560, but it was a difficult job. What she was trying to do was stem the rise of Protestantism, which was being kind of fueled by England, to mix metaphors. Yeah. But she was also trying to keep Scotland as French as possible, which was also increasingly unpopular. So yeah, a difficult job. And this was not for no reason. This was because she was trying to preserve the country for her daughter, for Mary Queen of Scots.
Yeah, what a difficult position she was in, too, when it comes to her daughter. And when we look back at the English, and the rough wooing.
Oh, God, yeah.
Just the name alone, it makes me uncomfortable.
I think it was Walter Scott, wasn't it? Sir Walter Scott, who coined the phrase the rough wooing. Supposedly it was based on a quote of the Earl of Huntly, who said, I hold well with the match, but I like not the wooing. And Walter Scott changed that into the rough wooing, which is one of these wonderful historical phrases. The rough wooing was what resulted after James V's death. So I should say how that came about as well. James V, as I've said, very, very pro-Catholic, very pro-French. And this led to a lot of conflict with England again. So that Treaty of Perpetual Peace, which had been very, very moribund by this point, fell apart again. It showed its deficiencies again in the early 1540s and the late 1530s, when Henry VIII is trying to kind of by the back door turn Scotland Protestant and make the Scottish king follow his lead in breaking with Rome and sort of deferring to him as the overlord. It's not working for Henry. But it does lead to a lot of border skirmishes as these two countries are kind of rattling their sabres at one another. After a victory against England, James V leads another assault on England, and this is the Battle of Solway Moss, which is, again, optimistically titled because there wasn't really much of a battle. Instead, James could not lead his troops in person. He was ill at the time in the Scottish borders, so he delegated, and he made supposedly a fairly poor choice by allowing his favourite Oliver Sinclair to have a hand in directing affairs. And they led the Scottish army over the border at Solway Moss, where it was very boggy and very wet, and the Scots became mired in this water. Some of them drowned. The majority, though, were taken prisoner by English troops and transported south. Something like over 1,000 influential Scottish leaders were sent south to Henry VIII. And Henry VIII did not treat them badly. In fact, he treated them very well. The idea being that he was going to buy them. He was going to buy their support, load them up with money and bribes, and send them north again to work in the English interests. And then he was aided very strongly by James V's illness, which had prevented him from leading his troops, turning into a fatal one. So famously, he went to Falkland, and as the story goes, he turned his face to the wall and died. He'd lived only long enough to learn that a daughter had been born to Mary of Guise. and this was his only surviving child. He'd had 2 sons with her who both died within about 24 hours of one another, which is sad. But Mary thrived, but she was a girl. So James turned his face to the wall, died, and Henry ceased the conflict because it was extremely expensive, but also because he thought, oh, maybe I can win control of Scotland this way. Maybe if this baby queen is forcefully married to my son Edward, Scotland will come as her dowry. So this was not a case of a Scottish king marrying an English princess and therefore the Scottish king gaining Scotland. He didn't like that. He did like the idea of an English king gaining Scotland via its queen. So he managed to get this signed into a treaty. This is the Treaty of Greenwich in 1543. And that is the Scottish government under its leader, who at this point wasn't Marie of Guise. She wanted the power, but she had to fight for a bit of time to get it. This was the second person in the realm, so the heir after Mary, descendant of James II, called the Earl of Arran. He has taken the regency and he's tentatively showing himself pro-English. Henry leaps on this. He begins sending cartloads of English Bibles across the border, for example, again, wind up the Protestants, get them kind of energised and turning against the Catholics. So he's doing that, and that has a long afterlife. And I should point out, this is the Bible in which Henry himself is pictured in the frontispiece as the magisterial figure. So people, even if they can't read, are able to have the Bible read to them in English, the Word of God, not in Scots, but in English, alongside images of Henry, the overlord, handing the Bible down to his underlings. So that's going on, and he is able to persuade Arran this marriage is a good idea. And this is signed, as I say, in 1543 as the Treaty of Greenwich. But Henry VIII can't help himself, as is so often the case. And he starts reneging on some of the articles of the treaty. So listed amongst its clauses was, for example, that Mary Queen of Scots was supposed to remain in Scotland until she was 10 years old. But Henry almost immediately starts, no, I want her now, send her south now. He starts demanding that certain strategic Scottish castles are handed over to him and English forces. And the Scots say, no, that's not part of the treaty, Henry. So eventually the Catholic party in Scotland, with Marie of Guise as one of the leaders and Cardinal Beaton, another figure that people don't really know about, but should manage to gain control. And they win Arran as regent back over to their side. And the Treaty of Greenwich is ripped up. And Henry is able to say, it's the Scots who have acted in bad faith here, not me. I declare war. And this was him at his most militant against Scotland. So not only did he launch invasions, but he gave an extraordinary speech and issued extraordinary documents in which he claimed that, for example, Scotland wasn't an independent country, had never been an independent country. The Pope had no authority to declare that it was an independent country. And that hero of Scottish independence, the one people will have heard of, Robert the Bruce, or Robert Bruce, Robert the First of Scots, and according to Henry and the documents he produced, he had just begun usurping the crown of Scotland from England. So all the monarchs, all the Stuarts had just been usurpers, according to Henry VIII in the 1540s, and he was just setting things right. So Henry was going back to his old playbook from the 1530s of, I'm not doing anything wrong here, I'm just restoring things to the proper order, the way it used to be. So he did that with the Reformation. Henry's Reformation, according to Henry, was not a revolution. It was the restoration of the ancient English church before the Pope had started usurping power. Now he's going to restore the British Isles as they were supposed.
As a contractor, I don't pay for materials I don't use. So why would I pay for stuff I don't need in my mobile plan? That's why my Biz plan from Verizon Business is so perfect. Now I can choose exactly what I want, and I only pay for what I need.
Right now, with my Biz plan, get our best price, as low as $25 a line. Visit Verizon.com/business to get started today. New lines only. Price per month with 5+ lines. Includes auto pay and paper-free billing and promotional discount. Taxes, fees, economic adjustment charge. Applicable add-ons, prices, and terms apply. Guarantee applies to base monthly rate and stated discounts only. Add-on prices additional. Offers in January 5th, 2026.
Abercrombie Kids is bringing the cheer all holiday season. And winter break means it's time for new outfits that are both festive and comfy. The last thing they need? New cozy coats for every occasion. Celebrate the season with Abercrombie Kids in the app, online, and in stores.
To be with England in charge, and before these Scottish faux kings had started usurping power. So that was the kind of playbook that he was going back to, and it became known as the Rough Wooing. The goal of it wasn't just invade Scotland and burn and kill, which he ordered. I mean, he was very clear on this. Put man, woman, and child to the flame and the sword. So Henry declared. But the goal of it was to seize the baby Mary Queen of Scots, kidnap her, bring her south, and have her again forcefully married to Prince Edward.
Why would he think that would turn out well?
God knows. I mean, this was a what if in history. What if he had gained control of her and she was transported south and married to Edward? If Edward had still died, then what would have happened? Would she just have been sent back north, or would she have gone back north? We don't know. But the marriage with Francis II then wouldn't have happened. So yeah. Sometimes I really enjoy the what ifs of history, looking at how that would have changed things. What I've really learned from this discussion today is that Scottish history is fascinating, and we need to be talking about it more, because I feel like it's even more dramatic than the Tudors. Oh yeah, one thing you get a lot of, or it's presented a lot of the time as kind of political drama going on with the Tudors, Thomas Cromwell and all the backroom machinations and everything.
Yeah.
Whereas what you quite often get in Scotland is people just feuding and stabbing one another to death, blood feuds and things. So it can be even more Game of Thronesy, I guess, than what's going on in England. But again, the personalities are huge in Scotland, and it's relatively untapped. How many people think about this kind of cocksure, peacocking Earl of Angus who's trying to be friendly with Henry VIII? How many people think of James V at all, and what his paranoia was like, and what this was doing at the Scottish court? Fantastic stories that just aren't told very much.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, you've mentioned a couple of times your book on Henry VIII. So for those who aren't familiar, you want to tell them what it's going to be about.
Oh, yes. So I've used the word overlord a few times, which maybe was cheeky of me, but this is what Henry VIII was selling himself as. So I'm working on a book now called Overlord, The Life and Reign of Henry VIII, with the new angle being that this is not just Henry VIII according to the well-known English sources, as important as they are. This is Henry VIII as overlord, as this proto-imperial figure, how he was selling himself and almost branding himself as in charge of the entire British Isles. And there was a lot of untapped material in there, in Scottish archives, Welsh archives, Irish archives. There are monks in the borders who are writing on Henry VIII and his divorce, for example, from Catherine of Aragon, who are saying interesting and sometimes very horrible things about Anne Boleyn in the 1530s, and no one's using these sources. So I thought, God, I better use these before somebody else discovers them.
It's so exciting. I can't wait to read this book when it comes out, but we have to wait a little bit, don't we?
Yes, I don't think this is going to be on shelves. It's in the UK next August, I think, at some point next August, and then it will probably be some months after that. I would imagine that it's out in the US.
I'm crying over here.
It'll fly by. I can send you a copy of the UK edition when it comes out.
I would absolutely love that. And I also want to give you an opportunity to promote your previous stuff that you've done as well.
Oh, yes. I've recently been looking up crossover Anglo-Scottish history and Scottish and English history and a bit of Irish history in Witches, A King's Obsession, which looks not just at James VI and First and his absolute obsession with the occult, but it goes kind of before that to look at Elizabeth I and witchcraft and how she oversaw the Witchcraft Act in England in 1562 and what that led to and what that was kind of conceptualised as and written about during her 45-year reign. And then it goes after James and looks at the legacy of these witch trials, why there were so many more in Scotland than England, what the monarchs after James thought of it all. James, a fascinating topic. And this spun off really from writing The Wisest Fool, which was all about James VI and First.
Yeah.
Another fascinating character who isn't as well known as the Tudors. I think it's changing now. People seem to know a lot more about James now, but yes, not quite as well known as Henry and Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots.
Yeah, exactly. And I had you on and we talked about that book in the past, so I'll make sure to include a link so everybody can go and watch that interview as well, because I remember that was a lot of fun to do with you too.
Thank you.
Now, I feel like you never talk about your other writing that you've done in the past.
Yeah, I often forget that I do fiction as well as non-fiction. So I have written novels set at the court of Henry VIII, for example, and at the court of Elizabeth from a fiction perspective. So dealing with spies, sometimes murder mysteries. This is something else that I get a lot of fun about. And I was asked about this at a talk last week. Someone said, well, which do you prefer writing? Do you prefer writing the non-fiction stuff about Henry VIII, about James, or do you prefer writing the fictional stuff? And to that, I say nothing, because I don't have an answer. I enjoy them both. I really do enjoy them both. I like the fiction because it feels like you've got a little time machine. It feels like you're able to think yourself into the court of the past, and you really have to focus on the sensory stuff. What did it smell like? What kind of sounds might you over as you're walking through the courtyard at Richmond Palace? What are you hearing from every different direction? Are you hearing servants singing as they're cleaning in another wing? Are you hearing the lap of the Thames at the water stairs? What are you actually hearing? So I like fiction for the sensory stuff that it gives you the chance to live in the past and even to look at processes. So when I was writing Of Blood Descended and Of Judgment Fallen, which are set in the 1520s at Cardinal Wolsey's court, I was thinking, how did the law operate? And how did people get around it? I mean, who had the power of arrest? What actually happened when a dead body was found? Really, who was in charge? So many overlapping jurisdictions. If it was court, it was the Knight Marshal, for example. So you really think about the nitty-gritty when you look at the fiction. I also like it, just one final thing, because I like to zoom in with the fiction on specific events. So a novel that I wrote called Succession was looking very much at the death of Elizabeth and that kind of week or two either side of it, what was going on, what was the atmosphere. Looking at, again, with Of Blood Descended, the visit of Charles V in 1522. When you write non-fiction, you don't always get, if it's a big biography, you don't get a chance to really zoom in on specific weeks or days or months.
Right.
You just have to kind of rattle through things to get to the next big event. I like the fiction because it really lets me go to town on what life was like that week or against that particular backdrop.
You know, that's a talent. Not many people can do both fiction and nonfiction writing.
So I think it's becoming quite popular now. Lots of people are doing it now, which didn't used to be the case. It used to be that I think one was looked down on a little bit. Fiction was kind of looked down on, which I don't get because I actually find it hard. I think it's harder to write fiction. I think it's I mean, if you write non-fiction, the plot exists. You're making judgments about history. I'm not saying it's easy, but you don't have to kind of think of a plot. You're more speculating on motives as to what drove people to the things they did. But you know what they did. Whereas with fiction, you're almost blind. I mean, you're going in blind. You're thinking, right, I have to create characters from scratch.
Yeah.
Or if it's biofiction, I have to whip this into a kind of story shape. So yeah, I think fiction's harder, but for a long time it was just criticised as frivolous and fluff.
Yes, exactly. But you did such a good job with it. You know what? I tried to write fiction once and I realized I cannot. I have ideas of how I want the story to go, but my mind is a factual mind. So it doesn't quite work for me to step back and create a scene.
Yes, I think getting over that. I remember being kind of unsure about what I could and couldn't do when I first attempted fiction. I'm making this up. Can I do that? Because you wouldn't do it in non-fiction. You
Right.
absolutely prohibited from doing it. Once you get over that hump and you're kind of enter into the scene, and this sounds very pretentious and very cheesy, but yeah, you just let the characters take over and imagine this is what they've been written as. I just have to watch how they would react based on that to certain things. So once you get into the kind of swing of it, I think it's very liberating, actually.
I wish I could do it, but I'm glad that you can.
You at some point you absolutely want to do it and be able to do it. It will just happen.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Start with biofiction. Start with sticking to the facts, but just adding creative interpretation. And then, if you want, you can always invent characters, construct stories. But yeah, biofiction is probably even, I don't know if it's more popular, but it's popular anyway. How many novels have there been about Anne Boleyn?
Right.
How many novels have there been about Catherine of Aragon? So,
yeah, that's a great piece of advice. So thank you for that. Well, Dr. Stephen Veerapen, thank you so much for coming back on the show again with me today and teaching us all about Scottish history.
Thank you very much for having me, Rebecca. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Tudors Dynasty and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tudorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. You can also join the conversation with me on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time, thanks for keeping history alive with me.